Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Accompanied by Dr. Tim Naftali, would you please welcome our speaker tonight, James Rosen. My name is John Taylor. I'm Executive Director of the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace Foundation, and it is our privilege to co-sponsor this event tonight together with our colleagues at the Nixon Library. When I was many years ago in the mid-1980s an aide to former President Nixon in his offices in downtown New York City in 26 Federal Plaza, he would hear periodically from a student on Staten Island with a mission and with a vision. He was a young man who had early on identified through his study of American history, particularly the Nixon years, that there was something missing in the written canon of the Nixon years in Watergate, namely a biography of John Mitchell. And he was still in college when he first began to reach out to President Nixon. So imagine all the years that have passed, the professional accomplishments. His accomplishment of writing The Strong Man is an act of will and skill, and also a considerable measure of heart. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to Yorba Linda, Mr. Rosen. Introducing him will be my colleague, the director of the Nixon Library, a distinguished Cold War historian whose expertise runs the gamut from diplomatic history to counterterrorism. He is the author most recently of a widely heralded biography of George Herbert Walker Bush, but he must now add to his portfolio the responsibility of construction czar. You may have noticed in the east parking lot along Eureka there is now green construction fencing because your next speaker is about to begin work on a 15,000 square foot archival addition to the Nixon Library. Right now he's responsible for a collection which is in 2 time zones about 2,500 miles apart. Once the construction project is done, all of the records of the Nixon administration, of which incidentally Mr. Rosen made such considerable use in his work, will be focused in one place here in Yorba Linda, and at long last, the dream of a whole Nixon Library will be a reality under the leadership of your next speaker and our host tonight. Would you please welcome Dr. Tim Naftali. Welcome, congratulations, well done. Thank you.
Let me begin, first of all, by welcoming all of you, but also by thanking John Taylor, because without the leadership of the Nixon Foundation, we would not have been able to acquire the money from Congress that has made this 15,000 square foot addition possible, and the ultimate transfer of the materials from Washington, and the end of my monthly commute back and forth. So for a number of reasons, I'm delighted. We are extraordinarily privileged to have James Rosen here. And we thought about how to set the stage for a conversation with James Rosen, to give him a chance to talk about his book on Mitchell. So if I can beg your indulgence for a moment, we're going to play a little snippet of a 1973 news report that gives you a sense of the climate of the era. And then I will introduce James to you. Paul? Note the colors.
Good evening. Former Attorney General John Mitchell and former Commerce Secretary Maurice Stans have been indicted on criminal charges. President Nixon has named a new Secretary of Defense, a new head of the CIA, brought John Connally into the White House, and reorganized the executive branch. There has been a sensational development in the Pentagon Papers case involving more wiretapping, and we'll begin with those indictments. Mitchell was indicted by a grand jury in New York on charges of influence peddling, perjury, and obstructing a federal investigation, an investigation into the activities of a financier who gave the Republicans $250,000 last year, $200,000 of it in $100 bills stuffed in a briefcase. Also indicted was Maurice Stans, President Nixon's Secretary of Commerce, who left the cabinet to become the campaign's chief fundraiser. The financier is Robert Vesco. It is alleged that President Nixon's brother Edward had been involved, that he verified that the $200,000 was to be given in cash. The money was given at a time when Vesco was under federal investigation. It was not reported, which was illegal, and it was returned, and the story got in the papers. Mitchell and Stans today both declared their innocence. Carl Stern has that story in Washington.
Stans commented at a Washington hospital where he was visiting his wife.
I'd like a short statement, but I will not answer any questions, obviously. Well, first, I'm totally dismayed at the action of the grand jury in New York. But I believe in God and I believe in American justice. And when all the facts are known, I'm sure that I'll be exonerated completely. Not only did I do nothing to help Vesco in any manner in his proceedings with the SEC, but the record will show that the SEC moved very vigorously against Mr. Vesco.
Mitchell heard the news en route to the Capitol, where he had been called for questioning by staff investigators for the Senate Watergate Committee.
I think it's one of the most irresponsible acts that I've ever heard of coming out of justice. There's no wrongdoing by me or anybody else that I know of in connection with this matter, and I have proper and appropriate judicial proceeding. I'm sure we'll all be doing it.
Today's indictment may be the most damaging development for the administration so far. The heart of the indictment, 12 of the 16 counts, deals not with a secret campaign contribution, but with alleged perjury by Mitchell and Stans. If it is proved that they lied to the New York grand jury, it will raise a question about their believability before the Watergate grand jury and other statements they have made. This is no longer the same case. In the beginning, the issue of Watergate was dirty politics, but now it has become a matter of whether top officials, past or present, are telling the truth. Carl Stern, NBC News, Washington.
Vesco didn't have anything to say today. He's believed to be in Costa Rica, and the authorities are not sure that he can be extradited if he chooses.
We at the Nixon Library have a remarkable collection of materials. We could not, however, find a picture of 5-year-old James Rosen. James was 5 years old at this time, and will explain to us actually what you should have known at the time but didn't and would learn later. James went on and has gone on to a phenomenal career. He made a few mistakes along the way. He spent 2 summers as an intern for the Nixon Materials Project when my predecessors were processing records in Alexandria, Virginia before they moved to College Park and before they will move ultimately to Yorba Linda. James Rosen is a product of Brooklyn, Staten Island, Johns Hopkins, Northwestern. He joined Fox News in 1999. He is now a Washington correspondent for Fox News, and he decided to tell you about the big enchilada. So I look forward to what he's about to say, and I would like you all to welcome James as he talks to us about his book, The Strong Man. During his talk, if you could fill out those cards, if you're interested in asking a question, please fill out those index cards that were handed out to you as you came in. We'll be collecting those, and we'll be giving them to James at the end of the talk. One last question, one last request, would you please turn off your Blackberries and cell phones? Even though you saw technology from 1973, we all have 21st century technology, which can be annoying. So thank you very much. James, the podium is yours.
I'm pleased just first to appear before you in better, starker Technicolor than what you just saw on that screen. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to John Taylor for his kind remarks. Thanks to Tim for his kind remarks. I want to thank the staff here at the Birthplace and Library. Just a few moments ago, they gave me a very moving tour of Richard Nixon's birthplace and boyhood home, and it was indeed deeply moving for me. Just because of the scale of the life lived here and the stakes that were involved in the atomic age. And whatever one's feelings about Richard Nixon, his story and the stories of people around him are uniquely important. And so I was deeply moved to have that tour, and I want to thank the staff for doing that for me. The first thing I want to point out to you is you just saw a report from May 10, 1973 on NBC News about the indictments of John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, and Maurice Stans, the former Commerce Secretary, on charges that they improperly interfered with a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation into the activities of the original fugitive financier, Robert Vesco, who fled the country rather than face charges that he looted a mutual fund of $224 million. That's 1972, $224 million, in exchange for his $200,000 cash contribution to the Nixon Re-election Committee. This was a remarkable trial, U.S. v. Mitchell Stans. They were eventually put on trial in New York in federal district court in February, March, and April of 1974, the very height of the Watergate frenzy. And guess what? Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Stans were acquitted on all charges. How did that happen? In the middle of that media maelstrom that you just saw, the very birth of modernity there, with the microphones and the cameras and the tapes and NBC News, it's all very modern stuff. And the answers are interesting. That trial marked the only time to this day that there has been a joint trial of two cabinet members. That trial marked the first time that the Nixon tapes were played before any human beings outside the government. That trial marked the first time that Richard Nixon's and John Mitchell's chief accuser, John Dean, in Watergate, was subjected to rigorous cross-examination in a court of law, and he got his clock cleaned. Perhaps the decisive element for John Mitchell in this trial in April 1974, when he's acquitted on all charges in New York. 6 months before his trial on Watergate charges in Washington, D.C., in which he's convicted on all charges. Perhaps the decisive element there was his choice of counsel, and I talk about that and the Vesco trial, as it's so known, at some length in my book. I wanted to just first answer some of the questions that Tim raised. How did I get this way? That's a fair question. I was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Staten Island. I was born in '68, so I came of age in the mid-'70s. I had an older brother, you see, there's the rub, 5 years older than me, who delighted in telling me, good God, you missed the '60s, you missed the Beatles, and you missed Muhammad Ali, and you missed Woodstock, and you missed the moon landing, and you missed Nixon resigning, you missed everything. And so I had this kind of insane desire to know what the adults had been talking about. And even in exile, even after he resigned, Richard Nixon hovered over the national discussion for quite some time, just as my other archival obsessions, the Beatles, even though they broke up, the four of them, when they were all alive, they were out there. They were out there. They hovered over the music scene. Whatever Led Zeppelin was doing is fine, but the Beatles are still out there, and they may get back together. And so whatever Jimmy Carter's doing, Richard Nixon's out there, and if that one tape surfaces, we could go subpoena him, or embarrass him, or prod and poke him, or get him to say something. And Nixon hovered over the national discussion, and I had this insane desire to know what this was all about. The irony, of course, is that today I stand before you able to discuss Watergate on a breadth and depth, with a breadth and depth unequaled by any other living human being, and nobody really wants to talk about it anymore. But you are living proof to the contrary. It struck me in reading the literature, as Tim mentioned, that there was a great big missing gap. And that was in the story of John Mitchell. John Mitchell was Richard Nixon's law partner in the 1960s in New York City, after Nixon had lost the Kennedy race in 1960, after he had lost the race for governor of California in 1962, and Nixon famously issued his inebriated, shrill cry of self-immolation, well, just think what you're going to be missing. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference. And so he was finished in politics, finished. And so he went east to New York to make money for the first time in his life. His whole life had been geared toward campaigns, elections, and public service. And there he met John Mitchell. The two of them were born just a few months apart. In fact, John Mitchell was born a few months after Richard Nixon. He was just a few months younger, both born in the year 1913. And yet, by all accounts, Nixon looked up to John Mitchell as a kind of an older brother figure. Why was that? Because when Nixon finally made it east, he found in John Mitchell someone who shared some very similar traits. They were both self-made men. They were both lawyers. They had both risen to extraordinary heights. John Mitchell had developed an innovation on Wall Street that was used to finance public works projects, the buildings of hospitals and roads and sewer systems, called the Moral Obligation Bond. And it was fabulously popular throughout all 50 states, and it made Mitchell rich. And it made him one of the nation's elite lawyers, to the point where Nelson Rockefeller reached out to John Mitchell. Hey, do this for me. And it financed Rockefeller's enormous building construction boom in New York State. And all 50 states copied it. It made Mitchell rich. But the great difference between Nixon and Mitchell was that where Nixon craved the approval of these upper classes and seethed with some bitterness when they denied it of him, John Mitchell held his Dewar's white label in his hand and squished the ice around and puffed on his pipe and really didn't care what the upper classes thought of him. And yet there he was, a member of all the same golf clubs that they were. He lived on the 17th fairway of the Appomattox Country Club golf course in Rye, New York. Good times. And the stories are replete throughout the literature of Nixon, even after he became president, talking in cabinet meetings and seeing where John Mitchell might be nodding his head no, and the president stopping what he was saying and moving on to another subject, and also where he would see John Mitchell nodding his head yes, or just puffing serenely on that pipe back when you could still smoke in the cabinet room in the White House, continuing on with what he was saying. And so not only was he his law partner and sort of this person that Nixon looked up to, he was his campaign manager in 1968 when Nixon won the presidency, his campaign manager in 1972 when he won the presidency. Not bad for someone who'd never run a political campaign before. Nixon wrote in his memoirs that he considered John Mitchell the single individual other than himself who was most responsible for his election to the presidency. And then Mitchell, quite reluctantly, after being asked by Nixon 20 or 30 times, no joke, 20 or 30 times, to take the job of Attorney General of the United States, Mitchell does so. He served as the 67th Attorney General of the United States from 1969 to 1972, uniquely chaotic and scary times in American history, unprecedented in their turmoil, but for the Civil War. An age in which we saw the killings at Kent State, the rise of radical subversive groups like the Weather Underground and the Black Panthers, when we saw unprecedented public crises and controversies like the publication of the Pentagon Papers, or something that remained secret until years later, the discovery that for 13 months in wartime, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been spying on Nixon and Kissinger, literally stealing their documents out of briefcases. And so after serving during this uniquely tumultuous time, during which, by the way, Mitchell, as the person who was in charge of choosing who Nixon would put on the Supreme Court, reshaped the modern Supreme Court, knocked off one justice and put on 4 others, including the author of Roe v. Wade. And Mitchell also during this time presided over the desegregation of the public school system in the South. When Nixon and Mitchell took office, it was 15 years after Brown v. Board of Ed, the historic Supreme Court ruling, mandated that all public schools in the United States must be desegregated, quote, with all deliberate speed, unquote. 15 years had passed. And in the South, when Nixon and Mitchell took office, in January 1969, 15 years after that ruling, nearly 70% of black kids in the South attended segregated schools. By the end of their first term, when John Mitchell left office in March 1972, having served 4 years as the chief law enforcement officer of the country, that figure was down to 8%. It's one of the great achievements of the executive branch in the 20th century, and it happened nonviolently. After all of that, then, by virtue of his involvement in the Watergate cover-up, not the break-in, but the cover-up, John Mitchell became the highest-ranking United States government official ever to be convicted on criminal charges and to go serve time. Richard Nixon did not do time. Spiro Agnew, who pleaded no contest to tax evasion charges in a corruption case wholly unrelated to Watergate, did not do time. The Attorney General of the United States, the nation's #1 law enforcement officer, served 19 months in federal prison and was denied parole as if he were some great threat to the community. And when Mitchell got out of prison in January 1979, that very day, the New York Times reported on an uprising in the streets of Tehran in support of someone calling himself the Ayatollah Khamenei. Just think how different times were from 1969 to 1979. Here was the man who was at the very top, the very pinnacle of the legal profession, And now he was getting out of prison, the oldest and the last of the Watergate convicts to leave prison. Disgraced, disbarred, broke. And he had his best line ever. He said to the media, who swarmed him for the last time, just the way you saw him swarmed there before, "Henceforth, don't call me, I'll call you." But no one ever did. There were 3 books about John Mitchell's volatile, deeply disturbed wife, Martha Mitchell, who, to be an American and to be alive in the year 1970 was to find the voice and the face of Martha Mitchell inescapable. She was on the cover of Time magazine, Life magazine, Look magazine. She was on 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace and the Today Show with Barbara Walters. Like I said, all the appurtenances of modernity. She was famous principally because in the master bedroom of the duplex at the Watergate condos that she shared with her husband, the Attorney General, she would steal out of their bed in the middle of the night while he was sleeping, have a few pops of whiskey, get on the telephone and call a reporter like Helen Thomas, who was then a reporter for UPI, and spew all manner of bile into that phone, and then sneak back into bed, and poor John Mitchell would wake up the next day, shuffle out in his slippers to go get himself the morning's Washington Post and see what the hell his wife had to say in the middle of the night. It was no way to live. There are 3 books about Martha Mitchell. Until this book, no books about John Mitchell, the real historical figure who was central to Richard Nixon's rise, reign, and ruin. And so that's why I set out to write his biography. It took me 17 years. I'm not kidding. I started in 1991, and it just got published May the 20th. I interviewed 250 people. I used the Freedom of Information Act very aggressively over many years' time. And I became, quite to my astonishment, as you may be sitting here saying, well, that's all well and good, but what is there new to be said about Watergate? Haven't we seen all the movies? Haven't we seen all the hearings, the trials, the books, the memoirs, the plays? And it's a fair question. And what I like to say about this book is, the scandal presented in these pages is not your father's Watergate. Because among the sets of documents that I was astonishingly the first to even ask to see, I will give you 2 examples. One was the internal files of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, the special prosecutors in Watergate. What did they know about Watergate, and when did they know it? Particularly about the testimony of the chief witnesses against Nixon and Mitchell, John Dean and Jeb Magruder, who were younger guys and more mid-level aides, whose testimony was used by the special prosecutors to secure criminal convictions of Nixon's top aides, John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman. What did the prosecutors know about these men's testimony, and when did they know it? And one of the reasons I say it's not your father's Watergate is that there are smoking guns right there in the Watergate Special Prosecutor's own files, the memos flying back and forth between the staff lawyers saying things like, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's all right here in the book, smoking guns like, Mitchell's logs of his telephone calls and his meetings support Mitchell on this and not Dean or Magruder, so we'll have to slide the date of that back to June 24. Dean said it was June 28, but we'll just have to go with June 24. Or Witness X supports Mitchell, not Magruder on that, so we would do well simply to omit Witness X from our case. Or Dean says XYZ, but the tapes of his meetings with President Nixon show it's really ABC. We would do well to omit that from our case. Another set of documents that I was the first researcher to see. Everyone here who lived through Watergate, raise your hand. How many of you, okay, lower your hands. Of those who lived through it, how many of you will say that you watched the Senate Watergate hearings? All right. The summer of 1973, right? Displaced all of your favorite soap operas, right? Worse than pestilence and locusts, right? It was. Everyone who lived through that time will say, oh, I watched every minute of those hearings. Well, very few people watched every minute. I read every word of testimony before that committee. I read the transcripts, 27 volumes. Almost every one of those witnesses who testified on television in that fabled summer of Watergate of 1973 first appeared for sworn testimony behind closed doors. Before they'd send them up on television to testify in front of the full panel of 7 lawmakers and the Klieg lights and the cameras, first they would show up to testify, accompanied by counsel, in what they call executive session, behind closed doors, with just the 2 committee counsel usually, meaning Sam Dash, the Democratic counsel, and Fred Thompson, the Republican counsel, later famous, as we know, from acting and from just this year acting like a presidential candidate briefly. The major witnesses testified in executive session. John Dean, 150 pages. Jeb Magruder, 100 pages. James McCord, one of the Watergate burglars, the one that planted the wiretaps. E. Howard Hunt, one of the conspirators who planned the Watergate break-in. Alexander Haig. Multiple witnesses. In all, 5,000 pages of executive session testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee. No one had read it until me in the year 2002. What you would see is subtle but significant changes in a witness's testimony from closed door to 3 days later when they go on television. And the usual, almost the inexorable result of those changes was that John Mitchell was made to look more guilty. And finally, of the 10 overt acts that Mitchell was alleged to have committed in the indictment in U.S. v. Mitchell, where he was convicted on all charges in his Watergate trial, I conclude he only committed one of them. So this is not your father's Watergate, and it's partly why it took me 17 years to write and research, because of the 2 criminal trials, each 10,000 pages long in transcript fashion, 250 interviews, all 27 volumes of the Irvin hearings, all 26 volumes of the House Impeachment Committee hearings. Someone had to go through it and read it all. And at the end of that process lies the truth. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions. So what you had in mind, more or less?
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay.
You know that James was named the funniest celebrity in Washington, which I find a phenomenal. Well, I mean, that means you're funnier than all comedians. Well, or does that mean you're the funniest journalist, which, by the way, isn't saying much?
Yeah. The title was funniest celebrity. I really don't care about funniest too much, but I cling tenaciously to celebrity.
Well, I have to ask this, James. While Tara, one of our interns, is collecting the questions, would you do one of your impersonations?
All right.
Just
all right.
one.
You already heard a bit of Nixon, I guess, but okay. I know which one you want. I know which one you want. That's fine.
I'm a sucker for this. I mean, it's very funny.
Good evening and welcome to Firing Line. William F. Buckley, Jr. Whenever anyone would assert the moral equivalence of KGB and CIA, I would often say, men who push old ladies into the way of an onrushing bus, and men who push old ladies out of the way of an onrushing bus, it seems to me, ought not be grouped together willy-nilly as men who go around pushing old ladies around. Thank you. Thank you. And one more.
You want to do another?
I'll do something a little more contemporary
show why you
for the people under 90 in the audience here. As our president would say, listen, appreciate your coming. What you got to understand is that it's hard work. And you know, there was a period of time there where we were getting our clocks cleaned by people who have the same footwear as Barney Rubble. And but we're past that now, and appreciate your coming. Welcome to the People's House. All right, thanks. Are you sitting?
Now you get a question. Now you get a question.
Are we going to sit for the question, or you want to stand for the question?
It's up to you. Do you want to sit or stand?
I'll do more, sitting? Yeah, I prefer
you better
sitting.
sitting?
It's a hemorrhoidal thing. That's fine. All right, no, I'm kidding. Too much information, I know.
Okay,
all right.
But your impersonations are so much better when you're standing.
Well, we can go back to those.
Okay, the question is, how do you view Mitchell's 1987 recorded opinion that the CIA was behind the whole Watergate thing?
That's a very good question. This issue of CIA involvement in the Watergate operation was very crucial. It bedeviled Mitchell to his grave. My conclusion was more or less along the lines that Mitchell laid out, which was that when Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, who were the head of this sort of little covert operations unit that Nixon formed in the White House called the Plumbers, the reason he formed that group was because in investigating Daniel Ellsberg, the anti-war activist who leaked the 7,000 pages of classified documents known as the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, Nixon was very disappointed in what he considered to be the sluggish response of the FBI. And it occurred to him that J. Edgar Hoover, at that point well on in years, was no longer able to really fully perform as he should have been, and so that Nixon needed his own in-house group to perform these kinds of covert operations. They were called the plumbers because their job was, in essence, to plug leaks of classified material. Howard Hunt, formerly of CIA, and Gordon Liddy, a trained FBI agent, were put in charge of that group. They conducted a break-in at the office of the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg that went undetected until the Watergate revelations. And then this same group, using mostly operatives who were Cuban and who were veterans of the Bay of Pigs fiasco in the early 60s, soldiers of fortune types, then executed the Watergate break-in and surveillance operation. Howard Hunt, for help with this operation, not only recruited CIA veterans and one guy on the CIA payroll, Eugenio Martinez, one of the actual arrested guys of the Watergate, but he also, when Liddy wanted some charts made for a presentation of what the covert project would look like, Howard Hunt went to CIA and had them make the charts. When they did the Ellsberg break-in, they got a camera from CIA, which to Hunt and Liddy's chagrin, or at least to Liddy's chagrin, they found only the CIA could actually open up the camera and take out the film. When they wanted what they call pocket litter, which are fake credit cards and identification and so forth, they went to CIA. So CIA was very well informed about the inception and progress and operational designs of the plumbers. It would violate every known bureaucratic principle in Washington, and especially those of the spy game, for the nation's premier spy agency, meaning CIA, to allow a little group like Gordon Liddy's ragtag band of soldiers of fortune to operate unchecked and target any office and anybody in Washington that they so well pleased. In short, CIA recognized from the work it was being asked to do for the plumbers that the plumbers had to be monitored, had to be neutralized. My conclusion is that James McCord, one of the arrested CIA veterans who was arrested inside Watergate, sabotaged that operation. And moreover, that the director of CIA at the time, Richard Helms, used no less than 3 men in this mission of neutralizing Gordon Liddy's little band of plumbers. And when John Mitchell said toward the end of his days that CIA was behind the whole thing, I think it was these intrigues to which he was alluding.
John Mitchell, strong, strongest.
Well,
that was Steve Colbert. What do you consider to be John Mitchell's greatest accomplishment? Thanks.
I think the desegregation of the public schools in the South is really something for which Mitchell and Nixon knew not even to try to take credit, because they knew that the people who stood most to benefit from this accomplishment and who would be most likely to cheer it were never going to be their electoral constituency in 1972. From this calculation emanated Mitchell's most famous remark, which he said to black leaders in 1969. It was a little more rococo than this, but it has been boiled down through the ages to watch what we do, not what we say. And what he was saying to black leaders was, in essence, you will not, under a Nixon administration, receive the rhetorical rewards of us saying the things that a black constituency wants to hear said. We're going to give those rhetorical rewards to white Southerners who we know have a chance of voting for us. But the substantive rewards of affirmative action policy, of housing policy, and most importantly of school desegregation policy, those will go to the African Americans. So in essence, watch what we do, not what we say. I think that's his great accomplishment. Outside of government, his great accomplishment was what he did on Wall Street, where literally through his invention of this moral obligation bond concept, public works projects essential to human conditions and standards in all 50 states were built.
James, somebody's asking you about the tapes that you transcribed. Tell people about the Joint Chiefs spying ring, please.
The plumbers, it turns out, actually did one little bit of legitimate national security work, as opposed to just breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. In 1971, in December of 1971, Jack Anderson, who's a syndicated columnist recently deceased, and a thorn in Richard Nixon's side since the 1950s, He had a knack for publishing classified information that eventually won him the Pulitzer Prize. He published the minutes of the National Security Council's sub-chair group on the India-Pakistan war about 2 weeks after those minutes were taken. Imagine being the Soviets and just all you have to do is pick up the Washington Post to see the minutes of the National Security Council. Thank you, Jack Anderson. He was rewarded for that with the Pulitzer Prize. The investigation into how those minutes were leaked quickly came to focus on a young 27-year-old stenographer in the Navy who was attached to Henry Kissinger's National Security Council staff. His name was, and he's still alive, Yeoman Charles Radford. And he was selected by Kissinger's deputy, Alexander Haig, to travel with Kissinger to China and Pakistan on secret trips when they were opening up China, on these long plane flights. And when Kissinger would fall asleep, Radford actually burrowed through his briefcase and took documents out of it. And his job was sort of as a stenographer and a gopher around the National Security Council and the White House complex. He would help himself to burn bags, trash baskets, and so on. In doing this, he estimated later that he was able to obtain something on the order of 5,000 documents over 13 months in wartime and give them to his superiors, who were two admirals who had offices in the NSC. They were the liaison between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. And those admirals, it turns out, passed the documents on to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas Moore. The plumbers discovered this. And John Ehrlichman, who supervised the plumbers, supervised Hunt and Liddy in a sort of broad way, and summoned John Mitchell and H.R. Haldeman to the Oval Office on the evening, 6:09 p.m. of December 21st, 1971, to inform President Nixon of what they had discovered. Nothing less than that the nation's top military officers, uniform officers, had for 13 months in wartime been committing espionage against the commander-in-chief. This is a federal offense of the highest order, Nixon said. Those tapes of December 21, 1971, that evening session in the Oval Office, and the ensuing days where Nixon can be heard on the telephone making his first call to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, making his first call to Henry Kissinger, making his first call to Alexander Haig, and other key players. They were released in 2000, those tapes. I was the first researcher to bother to go to ask to listen to them, and I transcribed them. I published an article about this called Nixon and the Chiefs in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in 2002, which helped me get my book contract. And they are a unique constitutional crisis in American history, and not enough attention has been devoted to this subject. I will finally say that in that Oval Office session on the evening of December 21, 1971, where Nixon's informed of this for the first time, one could be forgiven for listening to the surviving recording and mistaking John Mitchell for being the commander-in-chief and Nixon for being the aide, because after Ehrlichman gets done briefing and laying out the facts, it is to his strong man, his most trusted advisor, that Nixon turns for counsel. And Mitchell says, "First of all, Mr. President, the fact that this thing goes straight into the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it's as if the Joint Chiefs were robbing your desk." The title of this chapter in my book is called Robbing the President's Desk. And he says, so here's what we ought to do. And Mitchell says, first, we got to transfer the yeoman and the two admirals out to Kokomo, Indiana or someplace. And he says, just by way of sending a signal. Second, we have to get a security officer into the NSC. Third, someone has to go have a little talk with Henry, because Henry's not riding herd well enough in his shop. And lastly, Mr. President, I think I'll go see Tom Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and tell him that this ball game's over with. And to each of those suggestions, Nixon could be heard saying, right, 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 okay, good. And it's amazing who was calling the shots that night and how instrumental Mitchell was in shaping the commander-in-chief's response to this unique constitutional crisis.
Should John Mitchell have turned down the Attorney General job?
That's a great question, and it gets to the question of what was the great mistake in John Mitchell's life? How did he go from being at the pinnacle of the legal profession to being in prison in 10 years' time? And in the 250 interviews that I conducted for this book, there was a fault line that emerged. and people fell down on one side or another of that fault line. Some said it was marrying Martha Mitchell. And the most vocal proponent of that argument was Richard Nixon, who started saying it on the tapes as early as 1973 and who said it most famously to David Frost in 1977. If it hadn't been for Martha, there would have been no Watergate because John wasn't minding that store. The other side of the fault line said his great mistake was getting himself entangled with Richard Nixon. And of course, the most vocal proponent for that case was Martha Mitchell. What did John Mitchell himself believe? The conclusion I came to, of course, was that had he just stayed in private law practice in Rye, New York, making a ton of money on Wall Street, his wife would have been this eccentric lady who sort of drank too much and started to bang away at the piano at their parties with the other law partners. And that would have been their private shame. Had he had a more supportive partner at home when he was going through the trials and tribulations of the Vesco trial and the Watergate trial, he may have fared better there. But the twin pressures of Richard Nixon and Martha Mitchell were too much even for the strongest strongman to bear, and he collapsed under the weight of it. What did Mitchell himself think? I conclude the book with that anecdote, and I'll let you read it for yourselves. This is the TV business. It's called a tease. Okay.
Please comment on Magruder's statement that he heard President Nixon approve the Watergate break-in.
Okay. This question refers to statements that Jeb Magruder made for the first time in 2003 in connection with a Watergate documentary that was produced at that time. Bear in mind that he made these statements 30-some-odd years after his celebrated Christian rebirth, and under the dictates of which I still assume it to be a sin to bear false witness. One of the things you'll see in reading this book is that Jeb Magruder has told different stories at and about each stage of the Watergate scandal. His testimony not only conflicts with the other witnesses, but with himself on multiple points just in any given meeting. This particular charge started out as that John Mitchell ordered the Watergate break-in. No court of law ever weighed in on that. They only weighed in on the cover-up. No court of law ever addressed who ordered the Watergate break-in. History kind of informally records that it was John Mitchell, even though he denied this to the day he died. The famous meeting on March the 30th of 1972 in Key Biscayne, Florida, where Mitchell is said to have done this, was attended by 3 men. Mitchell, who said that he emphatically said for the third and final time, I don't want to hear this plan anymore from Gordon Liddy. Out. No more. Magruder, whose story mutated over time to say first that Mitchell approved of the break-in verbally, then that he approved it in notes that Jeb couldn't quite recall, and then that he actually circled on the document the targets he wanted wiretapped, including Larry O'Brien, the chairman of the Democratic Party. There, more or less, Magruder's story stood for many years. The third person present at that meeting, the tiebreaker, if you will, was Fred LaRue. Fred LaRue had formerly worked for Goldwater. He was a Southerner. His family had a rich fortune in oil and gas. He accidentally shot his father to death in a hunting accident. He worked in the Nixon White House for a token salary of $1 a year, sort of as a liaison to the South and on special projects for Mitchell. When Mitchell inscribed his photograph of himself for Fred LaRue, it said, "To the best friend that the President and I ever had." Well, LaRue's story on what happened at Key Biscayne remained the same for 35 years until his death about 4 years ago. And he said, Mitchell did not say, out, I don't want to hear it anymore. And he said, Mitchell did not also either say, let's start circling targets and let's do it. He said consistently throughout his entire 35 years on this, LaRue said that Mitchell said, this is not something that needs to be decided right now. So what does that tell you? It tells you that 2 of the 3 men present at that meeting testified that Mr. Magruder walked away from that meeting without approval of Watergate. That's where the record stood for the Senate Watergate Committee. That's where the record stood for the House Impeachment Committee. That's where the record stood for Judge Sirica when he wrote his book. And yet all of those bodies concluded Mitchell ordered it at Key Biscayne. In the 80s and around the year 2003, Magruder, as was his wont, started to embroider on this tale. And he suddenly started being, at first in the 1980s, it was a conversation between him and Mitchell in April of 1972, so a month after this, where they were in Mitchell's office, and Mitchell told him, the President wants me to do it, we have to do it. That was in the 1980s, to the author of a book called Citizen Hughes. Finally, in 2003, for this new documentary, he says, By the way, when Fred LaRue started testifying, doing that tie-breaking bit, Magruder immediately walked down with counsel to the Watergate special prosecutors. This is also among those smoking guns in my book, and said, you know what, I saw LaRue testify on television and it triggered my memory, and now I remember that when Mitchell gave the order, LaRue was out of the room. I think he was answering a phone. Literally, this is how bald it was. In 2003, he now tells us that actually he was sitting there, LaRue was off doing something unspecified, and Mitchell got a call from Nixon right there in Key Biscayne on March 30, and he could hear Nixon telling Mitchell on the phone, you must do this. Forgetting the common sense question for the moment of how were you able to hear, was he screaming his head off so you could hear him on the freaking, do this, nail O'Brien, we have to do this. How did you hear it from sitting across there? You're going to hear their conversation? Forgetting the common sense question, what about the evidence? Is there any evidence that the president telephoned Key Biscayne on that day? In fact, every telephone call of Nixon's, I think from that period, except maybe with some rare exceptions from the private residence, are in fact noted. And there was no call to Key Biscayne that day. You'd think the producers of the documentary would have done a hint of due diligence. So Jeb Magruder is a sad character. And clearly, he has still some things to learn in my lay view about what it is to undergo a true Christian rebirth, because a true Christian would not continue to bear false witness, especially against the dead.
What did the break-in at Watergate actually give to the people who ordered it?
The Watergate break-in was not just a break-in. It was a wiretapping operation. It lasted approximately 3 weeks, from late May of 1972 to the fateful arrests 36 years ago today, June 17, 1972. There were 2 wiretaps placed at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. One was on the telephone of the secretary of the party chairman, Larry O'Brien. Today, the party chairman is Howard Dean. The other was placed on the telephone of the secretary to a fairly insignificant DNC official named R. Spencer Oliver. The wiretaps that were used, as the man who planted them, James McCord, full well knew, required line-of-sight transmission in order for the sounds that they would pick up on the telephone to be heard in the listening post that was set up across the street from the Watergate complex across Virginia Avenue in the Howard Johnson's Hotel. That's where they set up all their listening gear. Chairman O'Brien's office was set so far back from the facade of the Watergate building and Virginia Avenue and the listening post across the street, literally as mathematically far back from that facade as you could get in the 6th-floor suites of the Democratic Party, that his phone and the wiretap attached to it was blocked and obstructed by multiple other offices and steel beams and so forth, and therefore, because it was a line-of-sight wiretap, could never have transmitted. And in fact, for the 3 weeks of this doomed surveillance operation, it did not transmit any sound. Moreover, O'Brien himself was publicly reported to be spending most of his time those days in Miami preparing for his party's convention. Spencer Oliver's office, however, abutted the terrace that overlooked Virginia Avenue. Therefore, the wiretap that was on his telephone did indeed enjoy line-of-sight transmission to the listening post across the street in the Howard Johnsons. Only one person knows what he overheard on those wiretaps, the man whom McCord handpicked to be the wiretap monitor, Alfred C. Baldwin III, a fairly undistinguished ex-FBI agent with no experience in wiretapping cases by his own admission, still alive. Because these conversations of Democratic Party secretaries and others who were using Mr. Oliver's phone were illegally intercepted, after all, a gag order has been in place since January 1973, when Liddy, Hunt, and the 5 arrested men went on trial, preventing Mr. Baldwin from stating publicly what he heard. However, there is some contemporaneous evidence from the early 70s about what the nature of these intercepted conversations was. Moreover, if you go and you hang out with Alfred Baldwin at his house outside East Haven, Connecticut, as I did back in 1995, and you spend 10 hours with the guy, 8 of which are on audio tape, and he's feeding you blank audio tapes when you've run out of them, well then, he starts to loosen up a little bit. And as I make clear in the book, quoting from these various sources, all of the known evidence we have that speaks to what the nature of these intercepted conversations was over Mr. Oliver's line, the one working wiretap in the Watergate operation, suggests that they were explicitly sexually graphic. In the 1980s, a theory arose that this telephone was being used by the Democrats, not principally by Mr. Oliver, but by his secretary allegedly, and by others, to set up dates for Democrats who'd come in from out of town for a night or what have you, and a nearby prostitution ring that operated out of the Columbia Plaza apartment complex, which is 2 blocks southeast of the Watergate building, and for which we have the prostitution and arrest records to confirm that there was in fact such activity going on there. In the 1990s, allegations were raised that John Dean's wife had her own ties to the Columbia Plaza operation. All of my research tended to confirm those allegations. This is why I say this is not your father's Watergate. But I will conclude this by saying, not having come of age in the Watergate era, but coming of age much later, I approached all of these issues with no dog in the fight. I began my work on a biography of Mr. Mitchell simply thinking that he was an underrepresented figure who needed a book about him, but who was guilty as charged in all things. I just thought we needed a book about the guy that made Nixon president, was Attorney General in this crazy time, and it's the highest ranking government officer ever to go to prison. And I spent 15 years trying to knock down or substantiate this call girl theory, which tends to exonerate Mitchell of ordering the break-in and a lot of other acts in the cover-up. And as I say, my evidence tended to confirm it. But I came at it without the passions of the era. And so one of the most important questions, which gets back to the question that the questioner asked, is this. Isn't it counterintuitive to assume that the one wiretap that could never have worked and didn't work and wasn't monitored during the entirety of this doomed surveillance operation was the true target, and the one that could have worked, did work, and was monitored for the entirety of this operation was somehow extraneous? That's what they learned at Watergate.
Who ordered Watergate then?
John Dean, according to the evidence that I developed and the research that I conducted, is the most logical answer for that question. We worked backwards here, folks. First, what was the true target? It wasn't Larry O'Brien. He wasn't even there. The wiretap on his phone could never have worked, as the man who planted it well knew. He was a master technician, James McCord. This is one of the reasons I tell you that he sabotaged the Watergate break-in. So the target was Oliver, R. Spencer Oliver, whose name doesn't appear in either The Final Days or All the President's Men, whose name doesn't appear in the 755-page final report of the House Impeachment Committee. John Mitchell testified he never heard of R. Spencer Oliver, and why should he have? You know what R. Spencer Oliver's job was? He was the executive director of the Association of State Party Chairmen. Basically, his job was to hold the hands of the 50 local yahoos when they came into Washington. John Mitchell, who was advising Richard Nixon on operations in Cambodia, the removal of the gold standard, and all other high matters of state, operated on a political plane that was miles above R. Spencer Oliver. So the question is, having identified what the real target was, why it was worth bugging, which we know now from the sexually graphic material on there, who would have been in a position to know that R. Spencer Oliver's phone was worth bugging? And as I say in the book, John Dean is the only logical candidate because of the allegations about his wife and Columbia Plaza. In the 1990s, Mr. Dean and Mrs. Dean, who I should point out deny these charges vigorously, either that he ordered the Watergate operation or that she has had anything to do with prostitution activity. In the 1990s, they sued Gordon Liddy for espousing this theory and others. The litigation went on for 9 years without ever going to trial. I say that the Dean v. St. Martin's Press is to Watergate what MASH was to the Korean War. That litigation saw offshoot litigation. Wells v. Liddy, Maxie Wells was Spencer Oliver's secretary. She sued Gordon Liddy. I had to testify in that trial twice. Baltimore Federal District Court, judge, jury, oak panel, the whole bit. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth? As I was being sworn in, I was saying to myself, Jimmy boy, if you had just chosen Greek antiquity or the Civil War, this wouldn't be happening to you right now. But I was the only researcher ever to interview Maxie Wells, Oliver's secretary, at length. 3 hours in 1994. And what she said to James Rosen in the early 90s differed subtly yet significantly from what she had told investigators in the 1970s and what she told her questioners in her depositions in this litigation in the 1990s. And as a result of all that litigation, there was testimony adduced to the record that tended to confirm Ms. Dean's relationship with Columbia Plaza.
What role did John Mitchell play in the cover-up?
As I noted before, the Watergate special prosecutors alleged that Mitchell committed 10 overt acts in the course of the 9 months over which time the Watergate cover-up took place. And I concluded that he only really committed one of them. And for the rest of them, they used deeply flawed testimony to secure their convictions. He was accused of authorizing the payment of hush money to the arrested men and their lawyers and families, instructing various aides to illegally obtain FBI reports about the investigation, instructing his aides to extend illegal offers of executive clemency to the arrested men, illegally attempting to get CIA to pay the hush money, and also various acts of perjury before the investigating committees and the grand jury. The only one of those crimes that Mitchell committed, in my view, was that he did suborn the test of the perjury of Jeb Magruder on one crucial point. Here were these 3 meetings where the Liddy plan had been proposed to Mitchell, twice in his office at the Justice Department, both of which, by all accounts, he said, no, get rid of this. And then lastly, at that meeting in Key Biscayne, he was no longer Attorney General by that point, which I discussed with you just now. Mitchell, as Attorney General, clamored for and won from Congress expanded powers for wiretapping against organized crime in this country, and against radical groups like the Weather Underground, and against foreign spies. Mitchell was very public in his statements saying that we need more wiretapping in this country by law enforcement. So who would believe that the Attorney General, who had clamored so vigorously for expanded wiretapping powers, would have turned down 3 times a proposal for the wiretapping of the Democratic opposition? Mitchell did turn it down all 3 times, but he knew the terrible appearance of it. And so when the prosecutors, in the early stages of the Watergate investigation, got a hold of Jeb Magruder's desk diary and saw that there were these 3 meetings with John Mitchell, they had to come up with a story about what the purpose of these meetings was. And I conclude that Mitchell obstructed justice by asking Jeb Magruder, he didn't have to ask too hard, to lie to the grand jury about what the purpose of those meetings was. And indeed, Magruder did so lie. But I conclude, again, that Mitchell was doing this to cover up the fact that he had actually acted honorably, which was to turn down this plan 3 times. He just was concerned about the appearance of it, didn't want those so-called 3 gemstone meetings to become known publicly, so he colluded with Jeb Magruder in the peddling of a false story to the grand jury. That is, to my knowledge, the extent of John Mitchell's involvement in the Watergate cover-up.
How has the media changed since Watergate?
There's a lot more of it, including Fox News for that matter. You know, you can hear throughout the Nixon tapes the president sitting in the Oval Office and literally banging the table. We've got to build our own media. We've got to build our own business roundtable. We've got to build our own academia. Forget the blacks and the Jews. Let's go for the Catholics and the Mexicans and the Poles. You know, and what he was talking about was the building of a counter-establishment. And even in Watergate, on the day that the cover-up seemed to have held, when only the 5 burglars in Hunt and Liddy were indicted, Magruder's false story to the grand jury seemed to have done the trick. John Dean is in the Oval Office for his first real meeting with Nixon. And you can hear Nixon saying, you know, this whole Watergate business, it's the last gasp of the establishment. The establishment is dying. They want to rewrite the '72 election. Well, they're going to try and use this to do it. That's fine. Let them have it. He would have been delighted to see the true emergence of a counter-establishment, such as we now have it in conservative think tanks and media and all the rest of it. He didn't really live to see that. But that's one significant way in which the media have changed. Watergate was the first saturation coverage event. in American history. By 1973, when the Watergate hearings started, 97% of American homes had a television set. 2/3 of American homes had 2 or more sets. But at the start of the hearings, Nixon's approval rating was 56%. By the end of the hearings, his approval rating was 32%. There's no doubt but that television played a very significant role in Nixon's downfall. The whole thing was televised. All of Watergate, with its voice-activated taping machines, which as a result, in the 3,700 hours that Tim and his staff are working so hard to bring to public access, probably a good 100 or 200 hours are just maids running vacuums or something like that, because it's a voice-activated system. It didn't distinguish between sounds. The voice-activated taping machines, the televised hearings, the IBM management ethos that H.R. Haldeman and his men in the White House operated under, all of Watergate can be seen as an information age event of sorts. And by the time the Lewinsky affair exploded, then we really learned what saturation coverage was. You had it easy in Watergate. One of my favorite things, the last thing I'll say about it, is there's a New Yorker, a cartoon that ran in the New Yorker magazine in 1973, and it showed on a train platform somewhere in Connecticut or what have you, 12 identically dressed commuters, men, all wearing the same hat, reading the same sort of Wall Street Journal type thing. They're standing there, each of them has their briefcase down here, and they've each got the same thought balloon. 11 out of 12 of them anyway say, Watergate, 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 and the 12th says crabgrass.
Well, I guess there's a segue to this question, and I guess it has to do with the Judiciary Committee. How involved was Hillary Clinton in changing the testimony of witnesses between the executive sessions and the public sessions? Who was involved in changing the testimony?
The future First Lady worked for the House Impeachment Committee. The executive session testimony that I was referring to, that I was the first researcher to bother to go see, 5,000 pages of it, was from the Senate Watergate Committee. However, the question still remains as to who was doing the changing of the testimony. And on this key question of what Mitchell did or didn't do at Key Biscayne in 1972, March 30, when he was alleged to have ordered the Watergate break-in, Magruder testified in executive session, again, unseen by anyone until me in the year 2002. And this is sworn testimony. This is not just some informal chat behind closed doors. This is sworn testimony. His lawyer was present. He testified that Mitchell, after he showed him for the 3rd time the Liddy plan on a piece of paper, Mitchell gave me verbal approval and handed the paper back to me. I'm paraphrasing, but this is the gist of the testimony. Sam Dash, who was the Democratic majority counsel to the Senate Watergate Committee, Dash, he made a notation. Yes, he made a notation, Magruder says. I can't remember what he wrote down, just a few things he jotted down, and he approved it that way. So right here in this executive session debriefing, this interrogation, we've seen Magruder change his story from he verbally approved it and handed it back to me, taking his cue from Dash, there was a notation that he made. Yes, I can't remember what it was. 9 days later, I think it was, he goes on television and testifies in public session, and not only does he now remember that it wasn't verbal, it was written, and not only does he no longer not remember what was written down, but he says Mr. Mitchell circled the targets that he wanted wiretapped, specifying Mr. O'Brien. That's how a story changes, subtly but significantly, and the end result of which is to make John Mitchell more guilty.
You seem to dismiss Martha Mitchell as ridiculous and inconsequential. How would you describe her being as important in any way to the history of the Nixon administration?
Martha was ridiculous. That's first things first. In the 1970s, there was an effort to try to portray Martha Mitchell as a brave lady, a feminist heroine who was surrounded by evil but determined to speak truth to power, who with all of her nuttiness sounded the clarion call that this country needed to hear. I don't buy into that version of Martha Mitchell. If you interview her first husband, who's still alive, who I tracked down, he would have told you that this was a problematic character. The details are in the book. I think it probably ungentlemanly of me to go into great detail on a stage about it. But this was a person who had emotional issues. This was a person who, on top of that, then developed a drinking problem. This was, on top of that, a person then thrust into the role of being a cabinet wife when she was ill-equipped for it. This was a person who was then taken advantage of by rather cynical people in the Washington press corps, some of whom could tell that this was an emotionally unbalanced person, but who still made good coin off of her and still continued when she would call you up in the middle of the night, obviously drunk as a skunk and out of her mind and spewing bile, would still put it in the, file it on the AP wire or the UPI wire and put it in the front pages as if it belonged there. And this was a person who then, on top of all of that, watched her husband become one of the most vilified men in America and watched him fall from the pinnacle of the legal profession to very serious legal jeopardy. And she came totally unglued to the point where she was physically attacking a female reporter on the street in June of 1973, escalating the shrillness of her calls to reporters and saying, "Mr. President ought to resign," in June of 1973. Not exactly helping the atmosphere in which her husband would have to find an impartial jury, and who eventually struck her own child, her 10-year-old daughter, right in front of television cameras that captured the incident outside the Sacred Heart convent where her daughter went to school. She would allude, Martha would, to knowing about all the quote-unquote dirty things that go on, but she did have her chance to speak her truth to power and to divest herself of all the terrible, awful, sordid things she had had an opportunity to witness when it was her great misfortune to be married to John Mitchell. That opportunity was her deposition in the civil litigation that the Democrats brought less than a week after the Watergate arrests. They sued the committee to re-elect the president for illegal invasion, for infringement of their rights. That, far more than the Washington Post and Woodward and Bernstein, by the way, was the great worry of the Nixon White House, where the depositions being conducted as part of that lawsuit. Depositions handled by the premier trial lawyer of the day, Edward Bennett Williams, who, by the way, represented not only the Democratic National Committee, but happily the Washington Post. And when Martha Mitchell gave her deposition in May of 1973, here was her opportunity to state under oath and on the record what she knew about all the dirty things that went on. She rambled for 73 inconclusive pages and emerged from that process swarmed by the media to pronounce, and I quote now, "I've never really known anything about the Watergate case."
Last question. Were Richard Nixon and John Mitchell friends after Mitchell left prison?
Yes, and Mitchell's lawyer, William Hundley, told me that Richard Nixon called John Mitchell in prison on the order of 3 times a week. And Hundley used to like to rib Mitchell about it and say, "You're going to take his calls? He set you up. He's all over those tapes trying to throw you to the wolves on those tapes. And here you're sitting in the slammer and he's out there in San Clemente with a pardon and eating well. And you're going to take his calls?" And Mitchell would just look at his lawyer and say, "Bill, you don't know everything." And it is an extraordinary testament to Mitchell's character and his capacity for forgiveness that despite the revelations of the tapes, whose chief revelation may not have been legal so much as human nature and character, that Nixon, under the right circumstances, could so cruelly throw the man that made him president overboard to the prosecutors. At one point encouraging John Ehrlichman, go gear up your office, go gear it up, so that Ehrlichman would have a tape recording of his meeting with Mitchell when he brought him down from New York to try and smoke him out and get him to take the rap. Go gear it up. That Mitchell forgave Nixon after all of that. And they spent time together in San Clemente in 1976. They spent a week together. I have the last photograph in the book shows a party in 1986. Nixon, Mitchell, George Herbert Walker Bush, and the inscription dated 2/15/87 says, "To John Mitchell, who helped us, all of us in our political careers, from Dick Nixon." So yes, they did remain friends. But the subject of John Mitchell was one that Richard Nixon stayed away from for the most part in the years after he left office. And then the one great exception, if you can ever watch the tape of it, it's fascinating to see, are the David Frost interviews. When unbidden, unprompted, Nixon says, "Can I just tell you one story about John Mitchell?" And he starts to emote and come close to tears, talking about the tragedy of John and Martha Mitchell.
James Rosen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good job. Hey. and tell them about the book. I want to again thank the Richard Nixon Foundation for co-sponsoring this event. We have organized a number of events about Watergate, among other things. And our next event dealing with Watergate will happen in 1 week when Jeff Shepard comes to talk about his new book, The Secret Plot, Secret Coup to Make Ted Kennedy president, and talk about his time in the White House during those difficult years of 1973 and 74. James Rosen's book is on sale in our museum store. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you. Thank you, James.